The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Martinez carefully sorted through boxes of gauze and antiseptic bottles. It was her third week volunteering at Seattle General Hospital, and she'd found a strange comfort in the methodical work of organizing medical supplies. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, stacking bandages by size and checking expiration dates on medications. She kept her palms facing down, a habit she'd developed over the years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. William Chen had been watching her work for the past hour, impressed by her systematic approach. There was something almost professional about the way she handled the supplies, not like a typical volunteer who needed constant guidance. When Sarah reached for a high shelf, her sleeve pulled back slightly, and for just a moment, Dr. Chen caught sight of something that made his breath catch in his throat. A distinctive scar ran across her left palm, not just any scar, but one he recognized immediately. It was shaped like a perfect cross, about an inch long in each direction, with the precise edges that only came from one specific type of injury. His medical bag slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. Sarah spun around, her eyes wide with alarm as their gazes met across the supply room. In that instant, Dr. Chen knew he was looking at someone whose past was far more complicated than her volunteer application had revealed. Sarah Martinez had arrived in Seattle 6 months earlier with nothing but a worn duffel bag and a carefully crafted backstory about wanting a fresh start after college. She'd rented a studio apartment in the University District, found part-time work at a local bookstore, and applied to volunteer at 3 different hospitals. When Seattle General accepted her application, she felt a mixture of relief and terror. The truth was, Sarah hadn't touched medical supplies in over 2 years, not since the night everything went wrong in Afghanistan. She'd been a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division, deployed to a forward operating base outside Kandahar. At 23, Sergeant Martinez was known for her steady hands and quick thinking under pressure. Her squad relied on her, and she'd never lost a soldier under her care. The other medics called her Saint Sarah because of her almost supernatural ability to keep people alive in impossible situations. The cross-shaped scar on her palm came from a training accident during her second deployment. She'd been practicing emergency procedures when a broken IV stand collapsed, its metal cross brace slicing deep into her hand. The wound required 15 stitches and left a permanent mark that looked exactly like a medical cross. Her fellow medics had joked it was a sign that she was literally marked for the profession. Dr. Chen had been a different person back then. Major William Chen, Army Medical Corps, assigned to the same forward operating base as Sarah's unit. He was 10 years older, a trauma surgeon who'd volunteered for combat duty after his residency. While Sarah worked on the front lines with the infantry, Dr. Chen ran the base medical facility, performing surgeries in conditions that would have been unthinkable in civilian hospitals. Their paths had crossed dozens of times during those 8 months in Afghanistan. Sarah would bring in wounded soldiers, her uniform often blood-soaked, her voice calm and professional as she rattled off vital signs and treatment administered in the field. Dr. Chen would take over from there, working frantically to save lives in their makeshift operating room. He'd been impressed by her clinical skills and her composure under fire. She never panicked, never froze up, even when casualties poured in during the worst firefights. There had been one night in particular, a massive IED explosion that brought in 7 wounded soldiers simultaneously, when Sarah had triaged the patients with the efficiency of a doctor twice her age. Dr. Chen had watched her work and thought she was wasted as an enlisted medic. She should have been in medical school. But Sarah had her reasons for enlisting instead of pursuing higher education. Her younger brother Marcus had been born with a severe heart defect that required multiple surgeries throughout his childhood. Her parents, both factory workers in Detroit, had gone deep into debt trying to pay for his medical care. Sarah had joined the Army partly for the steady pay and benefits, but mostly for the promise of free medical care for Marcus through her military health insurance. The arrangement worked perfectly until Marcus turned 18. Military-dependent coverage ended, and the family could no longer afford his ongoing cardiac care. Sarah had been planning to use her GI Bill benefits for medical school after her discharge, but instead found herself sending most of her military pay home to help with Marcus's medical bills. It was during this financial strain that Sarah made a decision that would haunt her forever. Staff Sergeant Kevin Rodriguez had approached her quietly one evening after a particularly brutal day of casualties. Rodriguez was a supply sergeant who controlled the flow of medical supplies to their base and several smaller outposts in the region. He'd been watching Sarah work and had a proposition for her. "I've got contacts who pay good money for certain medical supplies," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Morphine, antibiotics, surgical equipment, stuff that goes missing in combat zones all the time. No questions asked." Sarah had initially refused, but Rodriguez was persistent. He painted a picture of easy money, enough to cover Marcus's medical bills and then some. All she had to do was occasionally lose certain supplies during transport or mark items as damaged when they were actually fine. The black market for medical supplies in Afghanistan was enormous, Rodriguez explained, and their operation was small-scale and virtually undetectable. For 3 weeks, Sarah wrestled with the decision. Every time she called home, her mother's voice carried the weight of crushing financial stress. Marcus needed a new procedure that would cost $50,000, and the family was already drowning in medical debt. Sarah's military pay wasn't nearly enough to help significantly. Finally, she'd agreed to Rodriguez's plan. The operation was surprisingly simple. Sarah would identify high-value medical supplies during her regular duties and pass information to Rodriguez about transport schedules and storage locations. Rodriguez handled the actual theft, using his access and authority to move supplies without raising suspicions. They started small, a few morphine doses here, some antibiotics there. Nothing that would be immediately missed in a busy combat zone where supplies were constantly being consumed and resupplied. For 2 months, everything went smoothly. Sarah sent money home regularly, and Marcus was able to start his new treatment program. She told herself she was saving her brother's life, that the stolen supplies were just a tiny fraction of the massive medical inventory flowing through the base, that nobody was really getting hurt. Dr. Chen never suspected anything. Sarah continued to perform her duties flawlessly, bringing in wounded soldiers and providing the same high-quality pre-hospital care she'd always delivered. If anything, her performance seemed to improve during this period, perhaps because the financial stress about Marcus had been lifted from her shoulders. The first sign of trouble came when Major Patricia Williams, the base's chief medical officer, started noticing discrepancies in supply inventories. Certain high-value items were disappearing at rates that couldn't be explained by normal consumption. Williams ordered a full audit and began implementing new security procedures for medical supply storage. Rodriguez assured Sarah that the investigation would blow over. Supply discrepancies were common in combat zones, he said, and there was no way to trace the missing items to any specific individuals. They just needed to lay low for a few weeks until the heat died down. But Major Williams was more thorough than Rodriguez had anticipated. She'd been a military investigator before transferring to the medical corps, and she approached the supply audit with detective-like precision. She began tracking every single medical item that entered and left the base, creating a paper trail that would eventually lead straight to Rodriguez's operation. The net began closing in December, just 2 weeks before Sarah's scheduled rotation back to the United States. Marcus had successfully completed his surgery and was recovering well. Sarah was looking forward to going home, using her GI Bill benefits for medical school and putting the entire Afghanistan experience behind her. That's when everything fell apart. Major Williams had traced a pattern of missing supplies to specific transport runs that Rodriguez supervised. When she brought her findings to the base commander, a full military investigation was launched. Rodriguez was arrested first, and under interrogation, he quickly gave up the names of everyone involved in the scheme. Sarah was placed under arrest on a Friday morning while preparing for a routine patrol. She was escorted to the brig in handcuffs, her medical bag confiscated, her security clearance immediately revoked. The charges were serious: theft of government property, conspiracy, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and violation of her oath of enlistment. The military justice system moved quickly. Sarah's court-martial was scheduled for January, just 3 weeks away. She faced the possibility of a dishonorable discharge, several years in military prison, and felony convictions that would follow her for the rest of her life. Her dreams of medical school evaporated overnight. But the worst part wasn't the legal consequences. It was the look of betrayal and disappointment in Dr. Chen's eyes when he learned about her arrest. Dr. Chen had been the one to testify at Sarah's court-martial. As the base's senior trauma surgeon and someone who had worked closely with her unit, his testimony carried significant weight. He'd stood at the witness stand in his dress uniform, medals glinting under the harsh courtroom lights, and delivered facts in the same clinical tone he used during medical briefings. Sergeant Martinez was an exemplary medic, he testified. Her clinical skills were superior to many with twice her experience. She saved numerous lives during her deployment and maintained the highest standards of patient care throughout her service. The defense attorney had hoped Chen's testimony would help establish Sarah's character and mitigate the charges. But the prosecution had been more strategic. They'd asked Chen about the missing supplies, about the security protocols Sarah would have known, about the trust placed in combat medics to handle controlled substances without supervision. In your professional opinion, doctor, would Sergeant Martinez have understood the critical importance of these medical supplies to patient care? The prosecutor had asked. Absolutely, Chen had replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She would have known better than most how these supplies could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. Those words had haunted Sarah throughout the proceedings, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She had known exactly what she was doing, had understood the potential consequences, and had done it anyway. The fact that Dr. Chen, someone she respected and admired, had to state that truth publicly felt worse than any formal punishment the military could impose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The court-martial lasted 3 days. Sarah's defense attorney, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to the supply sergeant, had argued for leniency based on Sarah's outstanding service record and her family's medical crisis. They'd brought Marcus to testify via video link from Detroit, his pale face and obvious weakness providing stark visual evidence of why Sarah had felt desperate enough to steal. "My sister saved my life," Marcus had said, his voice shaky but determined. "I know what she did was wrong, but she did it because she loves me. She's always taken care of everyone else before herself." The prosecution had countered with testimony from soldiers who had been wounded in combat, emphasizing how critical medical supplies were to battlefield medicine. They'd presented evidence of Sarah's methodical involvement in the theft ring, showing how her medical knowledge had been essential to identifying the most valuable items to steal. Major Williams had been particularly effective as a prosecution witness. She detailed the extensive investigation required to uncover the theft ring, the man-hours wasted that could have been spent on patient care, and the breakdown in trust that resulted from the discovery that medical personnel were stealing supplies. When medics steal medical supplies, it doesn't just represent theft of government property, Williams had testified. It represents a betrayal of the fundamental trust we place in medical personnel to prioritize patient welfare above all else. The military judge, Colonel James Patterson, had deliberated for 6 hours before delivering his verdict. Guilty on all charges, but with significant mitigation due to Sarah's service record and family circumstances. Instead of the maximum sentence of 5 years in military prison, Sarah received 18 months confinement, reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a bad conduct discharge. The bad conduct discharge was what hurt most. It wasn't the worst possible outcome. A dishonorable discharge would have been far more damaging, but it still meant Sarah would forever be marked as someone who had failed to meet military standards. Her dreams of using GI Bill benefits for medical school were gone. Most civilian medical programs wouldn't accept someone with a bad conduct discharge, and she'd lost her security clearance permanently. Dr. Chen had approached her after the sentencing, finding her alone in the corridor outside the courtroom. Sarah had expected anger, condemnation, or at least disappointment. Instead, she'd seen something that looked almost like grief in his eyes. "I'm sorry it came to this," he'd said quietly. "You were one of the best medics I ever worked with." "Not good enough to avoid destroying my career," Sarah had replied, unable to meet his gaze. "People make mistakes under pressure. That doesn't erase everything else you accomplished out there." Sarah had wanted to respond, to explain about Marcus and the impossible choices she'd faced, but the words wouldn't come. Chen had nodded once and walked away, and she'd never seen him again until today in the supply room at Seattle General. Military prison had been its own kind of hell. Sarah served her sentence at the Regional Correctional Facility at Fort Leavenworth, surrounded by soldiers who had committed everything from desertion to assault to theft. She'd kept her head down, avoided trouble, and tried to figure out what she was going to do with the rest of her life. The prison had a small medical facility, and Sarah had occasionally been allowed to help with basic medical tasks under strict supervision. The prison doctor, Major Stephen Walsh, had been impressed with her skills and had tried to encourage her to pursue some form of medical career after her release. "Your military record shows you saved lives under combat conditions," Walsh had told her during one of their conversations. "That kind of experience doesn't just disappear because you made a mistake." But Sarah hadn't been interested in his encouragement. The guilt over her theft, combined with the shame of her conviction, had left her feeling like she didn't deserve to work in medicine anymore. She'd betrayed the trust that patients and colleagues had placed in her. How could she ever ask anyone to trust her with their health and safety again? After her release from prison, Sarah had drifted for months. She'd returned to Detroit briefly, but seeing Marcus healthy and thriving only intensified her guilt. The money she'd stolen had paid for his surgery, which meant his recovery was built on her criminal actions. Her parents had been supported but confused, unable to understand how their daughter had gone from being a decorated combat medic to a convicted felon. Sarah had eventually left Detroit and moved to Chicago, then Minneapolis, then Portland, working a series of minimum-wage jobs and trying to forget about her medical training. She'd avoided anything connected to healthcare, instead working in bookstores, coffee shops, and retail stores. But she couldn't shake the knowledge and instincts that 8 years of medical training had ingrained in her. She'd notice when customers at the bookstore showed signs of illness. She'd spot symptoms that others missed, recognize medication interactions when people mentioned what prescriptions they were taking, instinctively assess people for signs of medical distress. The medical knowledge was still there, sharp and intact, but she felt like she'd forfeited any right to use it. The move to Seattle had been another attempt at starting fresh. She chose the city partly because of its reputation for accepting people with unconventional backgrounds, and partly because she'd heard that some of the hospitals there had volunteer programs that didn't require extensive background checks. She hadn't intended to volunteer in a medical setting, but when Seattle General had an opening in their general volunteer program, something had drawn her to apply. The volunteer coordinator, Mrs. Janet Thompson, had been impressed with Sarah's application and her brief interview. Sarah had been honest about having military experience, but vague about the circumstances of her discharge. She'd emphasized her desire to help others and her comfort with structured environments. "We can always use volunteers who aren't squeamish around medical environments," Thompson had said. "A lot of people think they want to help in hospitals until they see blood or hear patients in cane." Sarah had been assigned to work in the supply organization area, helping to sort and inventory medical supplies that came into the hospital. It wasn't patient care, but it was adjacent to medicine, and for the first time in over 2 years, Sarah had felt like she was doing something useful with her knowledge and skills. The work had been therapeutic in unexpected ways. Handling medical supplies brought back memories of her time as a medic, but positive memories this time, remembering the lives she'd saved, the soldiers she'd helped, the skills she'd mastered. She'd found herself naturally organizing supplies more efficiently than previous volunteers, understanding which items were most critical and should be prioritized, recognizing when inventory levels were running dangerously low. Dr. Chen hadn't been assigned to work in the supply area, but he'd been passing through regularly on his way to surgery prep. As Seattle General's newest trauma surgeon, he'd been working long hours and had developed a routine of stopping by the supply room to personally check on inventory levels of critical items. He'd been impressed with how well organized everything had become since Sarah started volunteering there. He hadn't recognized her initially. Sarah looked different than she had in Afghanistan. Her hair was longer, she'd lost weight during her time in prison and the difficult months afterward, and she dressed in civilian clothes rather than military uniforms. But there had been something familiar about her movements, the way she handled medical supplies with professional competence rather than the cautious uncertainty of most volunteers. The recognition hit him suddenly when he'd seen the scar. That distinctive cross-shaped mark was unmistakable, and once he'd seen it, all the other details had clicked into place. The woman efficiently sorting gauze and checking medication expiration dates was Sergeant Sarah Martinez, the combat medic whose court-martial testimony he'd given 3 years earlier. Now they were standing in the supply room, staring at each other across 3 years of silence and unresolved history. Sarah's face had gone pale, and Chen could see her calculating whether she should run, explain, or simply pretend this moment wasn't happening. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the clinical detachment he'd maintained during her court-martial. She nodded once, unable to speak. Her hands had automatically moved to hide the scar on her palm, a gesture Chen recognized as deeply ingrained self-consciousness about the mark that had just revealed her identity. "How long have you been volunteering here?" he asked. 3 weeks, she managed to say. "I didn't know you worked here." "I started 6 months ago, finished my residency at Johns Hopkins, and came here for the trauma surgery program." He paused, studying her face. How are you doing?" It was such a loaded question. How do you answer someone who testified at your court-martial about whether you're doing well? Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity, but the sound that came out was closer to a sob. "I'm managing," she said finally, "working at a bookstore in the University District, volunteering here on weekends." Dr. Chen looked around the meticulously organized supply room, taking in the efficiency of Sarah's work. "It's not patient care," Sarah said quickly, as if she needed to clarify that she wasn't overstepping any boundaries. "But it's still important work. Good organization saves lives in hospitals, just like it did in Afghanistan." The mention of Afghanistan hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Sarah had spent 3 years trying to forget about her military service, while Chen had carried the memory of her skills and her downfall throughout his residency and into his new position at Seattle General. "I should go," Sarah said, starting to move toward the door. "Wait," Chen said, stepping slightly into her path. "Can we talk? Not here, but maybe over coffee sometime. There are things I've wanted to say to you for a long time." Sarah's instinct was to refuse, to maintain the distance and anonymity she'd worked so hard to create. But something in Chen's voice, not pity or condemnation, but something that sounded almost like regret, made her pause. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said finally. "Please," Chen said, "just once. There are things about your court-martial, about what happened afterward, that you deserve to know." Sarah stood frozen in the supply room doorway, Chen's words echoing in her mind. Things about her court-martial that she deserved to know. What could he possibly mean? She'd lived through every moment of those proceedings, had dissected every detail during her months in prison, trying to understand how her life had fallen apart so completely. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chen glanced around the supply room, checking to make sure they were still alone. "Not here. Too many people could walk in. There's a coffee shop called Grind Coffee on Pine Street, about 6 blocks from here. Could you meet me there tomorrow morning? Say 9 o'clock." Sarah's first instinct was still to refuse. She'd built a carefully constructed life of anonymity in Seattle, working at the bookstore, volunteering occasionally, keeping her head down. The last thing she needed was to dig up the past with someone who had been directly involved in her downfall. But curiosity was eating at her. What could Chen know about her court-martial that she didn't? He'd been a witness, not someone involved in the investigation or legal proceedings. His testimony had been straightforward medical testimony about her competence as a medic and her knowledge of supply protocols. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Chen nodded, seeming to understand that was the best he could hope for. "I'll be there at 9. If you decide not to come, I'll understand." Sarah left the hospital that afternoon feeling like her carefully constructed new life was crumbling around her. For 3 weeks, she'd found peace in the routine of organizing medical supplies, in being useful again without having to confront the full weight of her past. Now that peace was shattered. She walked home to her studio apartment, her mind racing. What if Chen reported her presence at the hospital to someone? What if her volunteer position was in jeopardy? She'd been honest on her application about being a veteran, but she hadn't disclosed her criminal record or the circumstances of her discharge. If that information came to light, she'd lose the only meaningful work she'd found since her release from prison. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone. She'd started to call Marcus 3 times, but hung up before dialing. How could she explain that her past had caught up with her again? Marcus had enough to worry about with his ongoing medical care and his new job at an automotive plant in Detroit. Instead, she found herself researching Dr. William Chen online. His professional biography on Seattle General's website was impressive. Medical degree from Stanford, surgical residency at Johns Hopkins, and specialization in trauma surgery with a focus on combat-related injuries. The brief bio mentioned his military service, but provided no details about his deployment to Afghanistan. She dug deeper, finding medical journal articles Chen had published about battlefield trauma techniques, conference presentations on treating blast injuries, and a few interviews he'd given about the challenges military medical personnel faced transitioning to civilian practice. In one interview from 2 years earlier, he'd mentioned the difficulty of watching talented military medics struggle to find their place in civilian healthcare due to various barriers. "Some of the best medical professionals I've ever worked with served as enlisted medics in combat zones," he'd said in the interview. "But the transition to civilian medicine can be incredibly challenging, especially for those who face additional obstacles related to their military service records." Sarah wondered if he'd been thinking about her when he gave that interview. The next morning, she woke before dawn, her stomach churning with anxiety. She'd barely slept, alternating between deciding to meet Chen and deciding to avoid him entirely. By 8:30, she'd changed clothes 3 times and was standing outside Grind Coffee, watching through the window as the morning crowd of professionals and students grabbed their caffeine fixes before starting their days. Chen was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He'd changed out of his medical scrubs into jeans and a blue button-down shirt, looking more approachable than he had in the sterile hospital environment. When he saw her through the window, he raised his hand in a tentative wave. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed through the door. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Chen said as she approached the table. "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted, sliding into the chair across from him. "But I need to know what you meant yesterday." Chen pushed one of the coffee cups toward her. "Black coffee, no sugar. I remembered from Afghanistan. You always drank the mess hall coffee black and said adding anything to it was pointless because it was terrible anyway." Despite everything, Sarah almost smiled at the memory. The coffee at their forward operating base had indeed been notoriously bad, but it had been hot and caffeinated, which was all that mattered during long shifts treating wounded soldiers. "You said there were things about my court-martial I deserved to know," Sarah said, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. Chen was quiet for a long moment, staring into his own coffee, as if gathering his thoughts. When he looked up, his expression was serious. "The investigation that led to your arrest," he said finally, "it wasn't as thorough as everyone thought. Major Williams did excellent work tracing the missing supplies, but she was under pressure from the base commander to wrap up the case quickly. There were irregularities in how the evidence was collected and processed." Sarah frowned. What kind of irregularities? Staff Sergeant Rodriguez wasn't just running a simple theft operation. He was part of something much larger, a network that involved multiple bases across Afghanistan and possibly some personnel back in the States. But once Williams identified Rodriguez and he gave up your name and the names of a few others, the investigation was essentially closed. I don't understand, Sarah said. Rodriguez confessed to everything. He told them exactly how the operation worked. He told them exactly what he wanted them to know, Chen corrected. But there were discrepancies in the supply records that went back months before you ever got involved with Rodriguez. Items going missing from bases where Rodriguez had never been stationed. Theft patterns that were too sophisticated for a single supply sergeant to orchestrate. Sarah felt a chill running down her spine. Are you saying Rodriguez was protecting someone? I'm saying the military wanted the case closed quickly and quietly. Afghanistan operations were winding down, there was political pressure to avoid scandal, and they had enough evidence to prosecute the people Rodriguez gave them. Nobody wanted to dig deeper and discover that the problem was bigger than they'd initially thought. Chen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder. After your court-martial, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the whole situation. You were a good medic, Sarah. More than good, you were exceptional. The idea that you'd steal medical supplies didn't fit with everything I knew about your character. But I did steal them, Sarah said quietly. I was guilty of exactly what they accused me of. You were guilty of what Rodriguez convinced you to do, Chen said. But I don't think you understood the full scope of what you were involved in. And I don't think Rodriguez was the mastermind everyone thought he was. He slid the manila folder across the table to Sarah. I started doing my own research after I got back to the States. I reached out to other medical personnel who had served at bases where similar thefts occurred. I talked to investigators who worked on related cases. What I found was a pattern of sophisticated medical supply theft operations across multiple theaters of operation. Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were copies of military investigation reports, newspaper articles about defense contractor fraud cases, and what looked like a complex organizational chart showing connections between various military personnel and civilian contractors. This is insane, she breathed, scanning the documents. You're talking about some kind of conspiracy. I'm talking about organized crime, Chen said. Medical supplies stolen from military bases were being sold on black markets, not just in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, Syria, and several African countries where U.S. forces were operating. We're talking about millions of dollars in stolen supplies over several years. Sarah found Rodriguez's name on the organizational chart, but he was listed as a low-level participant, not a leader. Above him were names she didn't recognize, some military personnel, some civilian contractors, some listed as unknown. The complexity of the operation was staggering. Rodriguez was a small fish, Chen continued. He recruited enlisted personnel like you to do the actual stealing, but he was taking orders from people much higher up the chain. When the heat came down, he gave up his recruits to protect his real bosses. Why didn't this come out during the investigation? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Because the people running the operation were smart enough to insulate themselves. They made sure that when investigations happened, they only uncovered the bottom levels of the network. Rodriguez and people like you took the fall, while the real criminals walked away clean. Sarah stared at the documents, her mind reeling. Everything she'd believed about her case, about her guilt and responsibility, was suddenly in question. She'd spent 3 years carrying the full weight of shame for betraying her military oath and stealing supplies that could have saved lives. Now Chen was telling her she'd been manipulated by criminals who had used her desperation to further their own massive theft operation. "This doesn't change what I did," she said finally. "I still stole those supplies. I still betrayed my oath." "You made a mistake under extreme personal pressure," Chen said. "But you were manipulated by people who were experts at identifying vulnerable personnel and exploiting their weaknesses. Rodriguez didn't randomly choose you, Sarah. He targeted you because he knew about your brother's medical situation and your family's financial problems. How could he have known that?" Chen pointed to another document in the folder. Military personnel records. Someone with high-level access was providing detailed personal information about potential recruits to the theft network. They knew exactly which soldiers were facing financial pressure, family medical crises, or other vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The implications were staggering. Sarah's involvement in the theft ring hadn't been the result of a chance encounter with a corrupt supply sergeant. She'd been deliberately targeted and manipulated by a sophisticated criminal organization. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because 3 months ago, the FBI finally cracked the case," Chen said. "The real masterminds behind the operation were arrested in a joint military-civilian investigation. The ring was much bigger than anyone had imagined. They estimate over $50 million in medical supplies were stolen over a 5-year period." He pulled out a newspaper clipping from the folder. The headline read, "Major Military Supply Theft Ring Busted by Federal Investigation." The article detailed the arrest of 12 individuals, including 3 high-ranking military officers and several defense contractors. "Rodriguez was arrested again as part of this investigation," Chen continued. "This time he's facing federal charges for his role in the larger conspiracy. And this time he's talking about everything, including how he was ordered to recruit low-level personnel to do the actual stealing while protecting the real organizers." Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her. What does this mean for people like me, the ones who were already convicted? The FBI has been reviewing all the related cases from the past 5 years. They're identifying military personnel who may have been wrongfully prosecuted or received disproportionately harsh sentences because the full scope of the criminal conspiracy wasn't known at the time of their trials. Chen reached across the table and gently touched Sarah's hand. "Your case is being reviewed, Sarah. There's a possibility that your conviction could be overturned or at least reduced. The JAG office has already started the process of identifying personnel who were manipulated into participating in the theft ring." Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. After 3 years of carrying the shame and consequences of her conviction, the possibility that her case might be reconsidered seemed impossible. "Even if that happens," she said slowly, "it doesn't change the fact that I lost 3 years of my life. I can't get my military career back. I can't get into medical school with a criminal record, even if it gets reduced." "Actually," Chen said, "you might be surprised about that. There are programs specifically designed for military veterans who want to pursue medical careers but face barriers due to their service records. And if your conviction is overturned, those barriers disappear entirely." He pulled out one more document from the folder, an application for a military-to-medical school pipeline program that provided full scholarships for qualified veterans. "I've already talked to the program director," Chen said. "She's very interested in your case, especially given your combat medical experience and the circumstances of your conviction. If your legal situation gets resolved, she'd like to interview you for next year's class." Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. For 3 years, she'd believed her dreams of becoming a doctor were permanently destroyed by her mistakes in Afghanistan. Now Chen was offering her the possibility that those dreams might still be achievable. But along with hope came a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Why didn't anyone figure this out 3 years ago?" she demanded. "Why did I have to go to prison, lose my career, spend years working minimum-wage jobs and believing I was a criminal while the real masterminds walked free?" Chen's expression grew somber. "Because the system failed you, Sarah. The investigation was rushed, the prosecution was more interested in closing cases than finding the truth, and nobody wanted to admit that the problem was bigger and more complex than they'd initially thought." The coffee shop had grown quiet around them as the morning rush subsided, leaving Sarah and Chen sitting among empty tables and the lingering scent of espresso. Sarah stared at the documents spread before her, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to process the magnitude of what Chen had revealed. "I need to call my brother," she said finally. "Marcus needs to know about this." "Of course," Chen said. "But Sarah, there's something else you should understand before you talk to your family." She looked up at him, seeing hesitation in his expression. "What now?" Chen pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails until he found what he was looking for. 3 days ago, I received a call from Colonel Patterson, the judge who presided over your court-martial. The JAG office has been conducting preliminary reviews of all cases connected to the Rodriguez network, and they've identified some serious procedural violations in how your case was handled. What kind of violations? Your defense attorney, Captain Rodriguez, no relation to the supply sergeant, was reassigned to a different case in the middle of preparing your defense. Her replacement had less than a week to review your file before the trial began. That alone should have been grounds for a continuance. Sarah remembered the confusion she'd felt when her original defense attorney had suddenly been replaced. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had spent weeks building her defense strategy, learning about Marcus's medical situation and preparing character witnesses. Then suddenly she was gone, replaced by Captain Mark Thompson, who seemed overwhelmed and underprepared. Captain Thompson told me that attorney changes happen all the time in military courts, Sarah said. He said it wouldn't affect my case. It absolutely affected your case, Chen said grimly. Captain Rodriguez had been building a defense based on duress and manipulation. She'd identified inconsistencies in Rodriguez's testimony and was preparing to argue that you'd been coerced into participating. Captain Thompson abandoned that strategy entirely and instead focused on arguing for leniency based on your service record. Chen showed her the email on his phone. It was from Colonel Patterson, marked confidential, and detailed the preliminary findings of the JAG review. There's more, Chen continued. The prosecution withheld evidence during your trial. They had intercepted communications showing that Rodriguez had been in contact with outside parties about recruiting specific personnel for the theft operation. Your name was mentioned in those communications weeks before Rodriguez ever approached you. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. They knew I was being targeted? They knew Rodriguez was targeting specific individuals, but they didn't disclose that information to your defense team. If Captain Rodriguez had access to those communications, she could have built a much stronger case that you were a victim of a sophisticated recruitment scheme rather than a willing participant in theft. The magnitude of the injustice was overwhelming. Sarah had pleaded guilty to the charges partly because the evidence against her had seemed so conclusive. Rodriguez had testified that she'd approached him about stealing supplies, that she'd been eager to participate for the money. If there was evidence proving that he'd actually targeted and manipulated her, her entire defense strategy would have been different. Why didn't any of this come out during the appeals process? She asked. Because you never filed an appeal, Chen said gently. After your conviction, you were so consumed with guilt and shame that you accepted the sentence and tried to put the whole experience behind you. You never challenged the conviction or asked for a review of the proceedings. Sarah realized he was right. After her court-martial, she'd been so convinced of her own guilt that she'd never considered that the legal process itself might have been flawed. She'd served her sentence, accepted her bad conduct discharge, and spent 3 years believing she deserved everything that had happened to her. The JAG office is recommending that your case be reopened and your conviction overturned, Chen continued. Colonel Patterson is preparing a formal recommendation to the Army Review Board's agency. Given the procedural violations and the new evidence about the larger conspiracy, he believes your conviction cannot stand. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling overwhelmed by the rapid shift from shame to vindication. How long would that process take? Months, possibly a year or more. Military justice reviews move slowly, and there are dozens of cases connected to this conspiracy that need to be examined. But Colonel Patterson seems optimistic about your case specifically. Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out another document. In the meantime, there are other options available to you. The Veterans Administration has expedited review processes for veterans whose discharge status may have been affected by criminal convictions that are under review. You could apply for benefits restoration while your case is pending. Sarah looked at the VA paperwork, seeing references to medical coverage, educational benefits, and vocational rehabilitation programs. For 3 years, she'd been cut off from all veteran benefits due to her bad conduct discharge. The possibility of having those benefits restored was almost too much to hope for. This is all happening so fast, she said. Yesterday, I was just trying to keep my head down and stay invisible. Now you're telling me my whole life might change. It doesn't have to happen fast, Chen said. You can take time to process all of this, talk to your family, maybe consult with a lawyer who specializes in military appeals. But I wanted you to know that you have options now that didn't exist before. Sarah gathered up the documents, her mind racing with possibilities and implications. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you do all this research? Why did you spend your own time investigating my case? You barely knew me in Afghanistan. Chen was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Because your court-martial bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I'd worked with dozens of medics during my deployment, and I could usually tell the difference between someone who was fundamentally dishonest and someone who made a mistake under pressure. You didn't fit the profile of a criminal." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "And because I felt partially responsible for what happened to you. My testimony at your trial was factually accurate, but it didn't capture the full context of who you were as a medic and a person. I focused on your knowledge of supply protocols without talking about your dedication to patient care or the impossible situation your family was facing." "You were just answering the questions they asked you," Sarah said. "I could have volunteered additional information. I could have spoken more forcefully about your character and your value as a medic. Instead, I gave clinical, factual testimony that probably hurt your case more than it helped." Sarah realized that Chen had been carrying his own burden of guilt about her conviction. While she'd been blaming herself for her choices, he'd been questioning whether he could have done more to help her during the trial. "Your testimony wasn't what convicted me," she said. "The evidence was overwhelming because I actually did what they accused me of doing. But you did it under circumstances that the court never fully understood, and that's partly my fault for not providing better context." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the weight of their shared history and the unexpected path that had brought them back together. Finally, Sarah spoke. "What happens now? I mean, practically speaking, what are the next steps?" Chen pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "This is the contact information for Lieutenant Colonel Janet Hayes. She's the JAG officer handling the review of cases connected to the Rodriguez conspiracy. She's expecting to hear from you." "Expecting to hear from me?" "I may have mentioned to Colonel Patterson that I'd located you and would be discussing the case review with you," Chen said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I hope that was okay." Sarah almost laughed despite everything. "You've been planning this conversation for a while, haven't you? Since the day the FBI arrests were announced 3 months ago. I've been trying to figure out how to find you and share this information." "How did you know I was in Seattle?" "I didn't. When I saw you in the supply room yesterday, it felt like fate. I'd been debating whether to hire a private investigator to track you down." Sarah looked at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' business card, then back at Chen. "If I call her, what happens next?" "She'll want to interview you about your original case, your interactions with Rodriguez, and your understanding of what you were involved in. She'll also need to gather additional evidence to support the appeal of your conviction. And if the appeal is successful, your conviction would be overturned, your bad conduct discharge would be honorable, and you'd be eligible for full veteran benefits. More importantly, you'd have a clean record that would allow you to pursue medical school or any other career path you choose." The possibilities were dizzying. Sarah had spent so long believing her future was limited by her criminal record that she had stopped thinking about what she really wanted to do with her life. The idea that she might actually become a doctor, something she dreamed about since she was a child watching Marcus struggle with his heart condition, seemed almost impossible to believe. "There's one more thing," Chen said. "The medical school pipeline program I mentioned earlier has a unique component that might interest you. Students who are admitted spend their first year working directly with trauma surgeons in major hospitals, getting hands-on experience before beginning the formal medical school curriculum." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Seattle General is one of the partner hospitals for that program. If you were accepted, you could potentially spend your first year working here." "Working with you, you mean?" "Possibly. The program matches students with attending physicians based on their interests and experience. Given your combat medical background, trauma surgery would be a natural fit." Sarah felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension at the thought of working alongside Chen in a medical setting. Their shared history was complicated, but she couldn't deny that he was an excellent surgeon and teacher. Working with him might help her process the trauma of her military experience while building toward a new career. "I need time to think about all of this," she said. "Of course, this is a lot to absorb in one conversation." Sarah gathered up the documents Chen had given her, carefully placing them in her purse. The manila folder felt heavy with possibility and the weight of decisions she'd need to make. "Can I ask you one more thing?" she said. "Anything. At the hospital yesterday, you said you'd wanted to say things to me for a long time. What did you mean?" Chen looked uncomfortable, but met her eyes directly. "I wanted to tell you that I was sorry. Sorry that your conviction felt so final and absolute when there were clearly larger factors at play. Sorry that I didn't do more to help during your trial. and sorry that such a talented medic was lost to the medical profession because of a flawed system. He paused, then continued, I also wanted to tell you that watching you work with those wounded soldiers in Afghanistan was one of the most impressive displays of medical skill and composure that I've ever witnessed. You saved lives that would have been lost with a less skilled medic, and that should count for something. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes again. For 3 years, she'd focused entirely on her failures and mistakes, convinced that her brief participation in the theft ring had erased all the good she'd done as a medic. Hearing Chen acknowledge her competence and the lives she'd saved felt like a small piece of her self-worth being restored. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that." They stood up from the table, gathering their things in the slightly awkward way of people who weren't sure how to end a conversation that had covered so much emotional ground. "Will you call Lieutenant Colonel Hayes?" Chen asked. "Yes," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I think I'm ready to fight for my life back." Chen smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since their reunion in the supply room. "Good. You deserve to have your story told accurately this time." As they walked toward the coffee shop exit, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. Not just vague optimism, but concrete hope based on real possibilities for change and redemption. The documents in her purse represented more than just legal paperwork. They represented the chance to reclaim her identity as a medical professional and to build the career she'd always dreamed of having. For the first time since her arrest in Afghanistan, Sarah Martinez felt like her future was something to look forward to rather than something to simply endure. Sarah spent the rest of the day walking through Seattle's neighborhoods, the manila folder of documents tucked securely in her messenger bag. She needed time to process everything Chen had told her before she could bring herself to make any phone calls or decisions. The weight of 3 years' worth of shame and self-doubt couldn't be lifted in a single conversation, no matter how revelatory. She found herself at Discovery Park, standing on the bluffs overlooking Puget Sound. The October wind was sharp and cold, but she welcomed the physical discomfort as a distraction from the emotional turmoil churning inside her. Ferries moved slowly across the gray water, carrying people to destinations that had seemed as unreachable to Sarah as her abandoned dreams of medical school. Now those dreams might actually be possible again. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor at the bookstore asking if she could cover an evening shift for a sick coworker. Sarah stared at the message, realizing that her entire perspective on her job had shifted in the span of a few hours. Yesterday, working at the bookstore had felt like a permanent situation, a quiet, safe place where she could hide from her past indefinitely. Today, it felt like a way station on the path to something much bigger. She texted back that she couldn't work the evening shift, then immediately called the bookstore's main number. "Page and paragraph, this is David," came the familiar voice of the store manager. "Hi, David, it's Sarah. I need to talk to you about something important. Could I come in tomorrow morning before we open?" "Sure. Everything okay?" "Everything's complicated," Sarah said, "but I think it might be okay eventually." That evening, Sarah sat in her studio apartment with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' business card in one hand and her phone in the other. She'd tried to call 3 times, but hung up before the number finished dialing. The rational part of her mind knew she needed to make this call, but the part that had been conditioned by 3 years of shame and self-isolation kept resisting. Finally, she decided to start with an easier conversation. She dialed Marcus's number in Detroit. "Sarah, this is a surprise." Marcus's voice was warm and energetic. "I was just thinking about you. How's Seattle treating you?" "It's complicated," Sarah said, echoing what she told David earlier. "Marcus, I need to tell you something about what happened in Afghanistan, about why I really went to prison. You told me why. You made a mistake and got caught stealing medical supplies. That's what I thought happened, but it turns out the situation was much more complicated than anyone knew at the time." Sarah spent the next 40 minutes explaining everything Chen had revealed to her. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the information. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Sarah," Marcus finally said, "you're telling me that you were set up by some kind of criminal conspiracy?" "Not exactly set up, but definitely manipulated and targeted. They knew about your medical situation and our family's financial problems. They used that information to recruit me. But you still did what they accused you of doing, right? You still took the supplies." Sarah appreciated that Marcus wasn't trying to completely absolve her of responsibility. "Yes, I still made the choice to participate, but I made that choice based on incomplete information and under manipulation by people who were experts at exploiting vulnerable soldiers." "What does this mean for you now?" "It means my conviction might be overturned. It means I might get my veteran benefits back, maybe even get the chance to go to medical school." Marcus was quiet again for several moments. "Sarah, can I tell you something I've never said before?" "Of course." "I felt guilty every single day for the past 3 years, knowing that my medical bills were what drove you to steal those supplies. Even though you never blamed me, I knew that if I hadn't been sick, if our family hadn't been drowning in medical debt, you never would have gotten involved with that supply sergeant." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "Marcus, none of what happened was your fault. You didn't choose to be born with a heart condition. And you didn't choose to have a brother whose medical care bankrupted the family. But you made the sacrifice anyway, and then you paid a price that was way out of proportion to what you actually did wrong." "I'm not sure it was out of proportion." "Sarah, stop," Marcus interrupted. "You've been punishing yourself for 3 years for something that was mostly done to you, not by you. If what this doctor found is true, then you were a victim of a criminal conspiracy that used your love for me as a weapon against you." The clarity in Marcus's voice surprised Sarah. Her younger brother had always been thoughtful, but he'd never spoken with such directness about difficult emotional topics. "When did you become so wise?" she asked. "When I spent 6 months in cardiac rehabilitation talking to a counselor about survivor guilt and family dynamics," Marcus said. "Turns out having a life-threatening illness gives you a lot of time to think about how your problems affect the people you love." "What did the counselor say?" "That sometimes the people who love us make choices that seem like sacrifices, but they're really making those choices because they can't live with themselves if they don't try to help." "She said that you didn't steal those supplies because I was sick. You stole them because that's who you are as a person. Someone who can't stand by and watch people suffer when there's something you can do about it." I'm not sure Marcus understood her motivations better than she'd understood them herself. She'd spent 3 years focused on the guilt and shame of her actions, but she'd never really examined the underlying drive that had made her vulnerable to Rodriguez's manipulation in the first place. "I need to call the JAG officer tomorrow," she said. "Good. And Sarah, whatever happens with your case, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You're one of the strongest people I know, and you deserve to have your life back." After they hung up, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but more centered than she'd been in months. Marcus's perspective had helped her understand that pursuing the appeal of her conviction wasn't about avoiding responsibility for her actions. It was about ensuring that her actions were understood in your proper context. The next morning, Sarah met with David at the bookstore before opening hours. She explained that she might need to take extended time off for legal proceedings related to her military service. David, who had always been supportive and understanding, listened carefully to her explanation. "Will this affect your background check for working here?" he asked. "It might actually improve it," Sarah said. "If my conviction gets overturned, I'll have a clean record again." "Good for you," David said sincerely. "You've been one of our best employees, and honestly, you've always seemed overqualified for retail work. If you need flexible scheduling or time off for meetings with lawyers, just let me know." At 10 o'clock, Sarah finally made the call to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, JAG Corps." "Ma'am, this is Sarah Martinez. Dr. William Chen said you were expecting my call regarding the review of my court-martial case." "Ms. Martinez, yes, thank you for calling. I've been reviewing your file, and I have to say, your case represents some of the most egregious procedural violations I've seen in 15 years of military justice work. The directness of the statement surprised Sarah. Dr. Chen mentioned there were problems with how my case was handled. Problems is an understatement. Your defense counsel was changed without adequate justification, evidence was withheld from your defense team, and the prosecution failed to disclose information that was directly relevant to your case. Under current military justice standards, your conviction would have been overturned on appeal. But I never filed an appeal, which is understandable given the circumstances, but unfortunate from a legal standpoint. However, the new evidence related to the Rodriguez conspiracy gives us grounds to reopen your case even without a formal appeal. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes explained the process in detail. The JAG office would conduct a formal review of Sarah's case, examining all the evidence and procedural violations. They would also interview Sarah about her interactions with Rodriguez and her understanding of the theft operation. If their review confirmed the preliminary findings, they would recommend that Sarah's conviction be overturned and her discharge status upgraded. How long does this process typically take? Sarah asked. Given the complexity of the Rodriguez conspiracy and the number of related cases under review, I'd estimate 6 to 12 months for a final resolution. However, we can begin processing some benefits restoration immediately, particularly healthcare coverage through the VA. What do I need to do? First, I need you to come to Joint Base Lewis McChord for a formal interview. We'll want to go through your entire experience with Rodriguez, from the initial contact through your participation in the supply theft. Second, I need you to sign releases allowing us to access all the records from your original court-martial, including any notes or files from your defense counsel. Sarah scheduled the interview for the following week, then spent the rest of the day researching the medical school pipeline Chen had mentioned. The program's website described an innovative approach to training military veterans for careers in medicine, with an emphasis on trauma care and emergency medicine. The application process was extensive, requiring undergraduate transcripts, letters of recommendation, a personal statement, and documentation of military medical experience. Sarah realized she'd need to gather transcripts from her community college courses and find people willing to write recommendations, a challenge given how isolated she'd become over the past 3 years. That afternoon, she returned to Seattle General for her regular volunteer shift. The supply room felt different now, charged with new meaning. Instead of a place where she could quietly use her medical knowledge without confronting her past, it now felt like a training ground for her future. Chen found her there an hour into her shift, organizing inventory with the same methodical precision she'd always shown. "How did the phone calls go?" he asked. "Better than I expected," Sarah said. "I'm meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes next week, and my brother was incredibly supportive. I also talked to my manager at the bookstore about potentially taking time off." "That's all great news. Have you thought about the medical school program?" "I've been researching it, but the application process is pretty involved. I need transcripts, recommendations, and a personal statement. It's been 3 years since I've had to think of myself as someone worthy of recommendations." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Would you be open to having some help with that process?" "What kind of help?" "I know the program director personally, Dr. Rebecca Santos. She's a former Navy surgeon who started this program specifically for military veterans who face barriers to traditional medical school admission. If you're interested, I could introduce you to her informally, maybe over coffee, so you could learn more about the program before deciding whether to apply." Sarah felt a familiar mix of hope and anxiety. Every new opportunity felt simultaneously exciting and terrifying, loaded with the potential for both success and failure. "Would that introduction come with your recommendation?" she asked. "Only if you want it to. But yes, I'd be happy to recommend you based on your combat medical experience and your volunteer work here. You've demonstrated both the clinical knowledge and the dedication to patient care that the program is looking for." "Even given my criminal record?" "Especially given your criminal record and the circumstances around it. Dr. Santos has said that some of the program's most successful graduates are veterans who've overcome significant challenges. Your experience, both the positive aspects and the difficult ones, would actually make you a stronger candidate, not a weaker one." Sarah finished organizing the gauze supplies she'd been working on, thinking about the path that was opening up before her. 3 days ago, her biggest aspiration had been to maintain her anonymous volunteer position and keep her head down. Now she was contemplating a future that included medical school, a career as a doctor, and the possibility of working alongside the trauma surgeon who had helped uncover the truth about her case. "Dr. Chen," she said finally, "would you be willing to introduce me to Dr. Santos?" "I'll call her this afternoon," Chen said, smiling, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "Stop calling me Dr. Chen. We've been through too much together for that level of formality. My friends call me Will." Sarah smiled back, feeling another small piece of her isolation beginning to crack. "Okay, Will, and my friends call me Sarah, not Sergeant Martinez." "Deal," Will said. "Now let's finish organizing these supplies. I have a feeling you're going to know where everything is when you start working here as a medical student." For the first time in 3 years, Sarah allowed herself to truly believe that her future might include the career she'd always dreamed of. The path would be complicated, involving legal proceedings and academic challenges, and the ongoing work of rebuilding her identity as a medical professional. But as she stood in the supply room at Seattle General, efficiently organizing materials that could save lives, Sarah Martinez began to feel like herself again. Not the broken veteran or the convicted criminal she'd believed herself to be, but the skilled medic who had saved lives under impossible conditions and who might yet become the doctor she'd always wanted to be. The interview lasted 4 hours, with Hayes taking Sarah through every detail of her military service, her family's financial situation, and her interactions with Rodriguez. The JAG officer was particularly interested in the timeline of events, when Rodriguez first approached her, how he learned about Marcus's medical situation, and what specific information he provided about the theft operation. "Tell me about Rodriguez's initial approach," Hayes said, checking her notes. "How did he first bring up the possibility of stealing supplies?" Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember conversations she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. It was after a particularly bad day. We'd had 7 casualties from an IED attack, and I'd been working for almost 18 hours straight. Rodriguez found me in the mess hall around midnight, said he'd been watching me work and was impressed with how I handled pressure. Did he mention money immediately? No, he started by talking about how hard it must be to watch soldiers suffer when you know there are people back home who can't afford basic medical care. He said he'd heard that military families sometimes struggled with medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance. Hayes made detailed notes. "So he knew about your brother's situation before he ever mentioned theft?" "It seemed like it, though I didn't realize how much he knew at the time. He mentioned that heart surgery was expensive and that sometimes the Army didn't cover all the costs for family members. I was surprised he knew about Marcus's condition, but I figured word got around in a small base community. Did Rodriguez ever explain how he learned about your family's situation?" "He said he paid attention to his soldiers' morale and tried to know when people were dealing with stress that might affect their performance. It seemed reasonable at the time. Good leaders are supposed to know what's affecting their troops." Hayes showed Sarah a document from the FBI investigation. According to Rodriguez's recent testimony, he was provided with detailed personal information about potential recruitment targets by someone with access to personnel files and family records. Your brother's medical history, your family's financial situation, even your parents' employment status, all of that information was compiled in a dossier that Rodriguez received before he ever approached you. Sarah stared at the document, seeing her family's private information laid out in clinical detail. Someone had researched their lives with the specific goal of identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited. "This is how they operated across multiple bases," Hayes continued. "They identified soldiers who were facing financial pressure, family medical crises, or other personal challenges that might make them susceptible to recruitment. It was a systematic process, not random opportunism." The scope of the manipulation was staggering. Sarah had spent 3 years believing she'd been weak or greedy, that she'd betrayed her oath for easy money. Learning that she'd been deliberately targeted by professionals who specialized in exploiting vulnerable soldiers changed her entire understanding of what had happened. How many soldiers were recruited this way? Sarah asked. The FBI has identified 43 military personnel across 8 different bases who were recruited using similar methods. Most were enlisted soldiers, but there were also several junior officers and even a few senior NCOs who were facing divorce proceedings or other expensive life situations. Hayes pulled out another folder. Here's what makes your case particularly egregious from a justice standpoint. The prosecution in your court-martial had access to communications showing that Rodriguez had been asking his contacts for information about soldiers who might be good recruitment targets. Your name appears in those communications 3 weeks before Rodriguez ever spoke to you. The prosecution knew I was being targeted. They knew Rodriguez was systematically recruiting soldiers based on personal information provided by outside sources. They chose not to share that information with your defense team, and they didn't investigate who was providing Rodriguez with the personal data he used for recruitment. Sarah felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. Why didn't they investigate? If they knew Rodriguez was getting information from someone else, why didn't they try to find out who? Because the base commander and the prosecution were under pressure to close the case quickly and quietly. Your unit was scheduled to rotate back to the States, there were congressional inquiries about military supply security, and nobody wanted to admit that the problem was bigger and more sophisticated than initially thought. Hayes showed Sarah copies of emails between the prosecution team and senior military leadership. The messages made it clear that the goal was to prosecute the soldiers Rodriguez had identified and close the case, not to investigate the broader conspiracy. Your case was essentially used as a demonstration that the military was taking supply theft seriously. The prosecution was more interested in convictions than in understanding the full scope of the criminal network. The injustice was overwhelming. Sarah's military career, her dreams of medical school, her 3 years of shame and isolation, all of it had been sacrificed to help military leadership avoid admitting that they'd failed to protect their own soldiers from sophisticated criminal manipulation. What happened to the people who were really running this operation? Sarah asked. Most of them were arrested in the FBI operation 3 months ago. The mastermind was a civilian contractor named Michael Stevenson who had access to military personnel databases through his company's contracts with the Department of Defense. He's facing federal charges that could result in life imprisonment. Hayes pulled out newspaper clippings about Stevenson's arrest. The man had been running medical supply theft operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several African countries where U.S. forces were deployed. His network had stolen an estimated $50 million worth of medical supplies over 5 years. Stevenson specifically targeted combat medics and hospital corpsmen for recruitment because they had the knowledge to identify valuable supplies and the access to steal them without immediately raising suspicions, Hayes explained. Rodriguez was just one of several supply sergeants who worked for Stevenson's organization. So Rodriguez was manipulating me on orders from someone else? According to his recent testimony, yes. Stevenson's organization provided Rodriguez with detailed profiles of potential recruits, specific talking points for approaching them, and strategies for overcoming their resistance to participating in theft. Sarah realized that every aspect of her recruitment had been planned and scripted. Rodriguez hadn't randomly decided to approach her. He'd been following a playbook designed by professionals who understood exactly how to exploit her love for her brother and her family's desperation. The good news, Hayes continued, is that this information provides overwhelming grounds for overturning your conviction. The prosecution's failure to disclose evidence of the broader conspiracy, combined with the procedural violations in your original trial, creates a strong case for complete exoneration. What does that mean practically? It means your conviction would be overturned, your discharge status would be upgraded to honorable, and you'd be eligible for full restoration of veteran benefits. It also means your military record would show that you were wrongfully convicted due to prosecutorial misconduct and inadequate defense representation. The possibility of complete exoneration felt almost too good to be true. Sarah had hoped for a reduction in her charges or an upgrade in her discharge status, but the idea that her conviction might be entirely overturned exceeded her wildest expectations. How long will this process take? Given the strength of the evidence and the number of procedural violations, I expect to complete my review within 6 weeks. If my recommendation is approved by the Army Review Board's agency, the entire process could be completed within 4 months. Hayes handed Sarah a thick packet of paperwork. In the meantime, I'm recommending immediate restoration of your VA healthcare benefits. The VA has expedited procedures for veterans whose cases are under review for wrongful conviction. After the interview, Sarah drove back to Seattle feeling emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic. The meeting with Hayes had been more thorough and supportive than she dared to hope, and the evidence supporting her case seemed overwhelming. She stopped at a rest area near Olympia and called Will to let him know how the interview had gone. "It sounds like Hayes is confident about your case," Will said after Sarah summarized the meeting. "That's fantastic news." "It still feels surreal," Sarah said. 3 years ago, I was convinced I was guilty of everything they accused me of. Now it turns out I was actually a victim of a criminal conspiracy." "Both things can be true," Will said gently. "You did participate in stealing those supplies, but you did it because professionals who specialized in manipulation convinced you it was your only option. That doesn't make you a criminal, it makes you someone who was exploited by criminals." Hayes said I might be completely exonerated. "How does that feel?" Sarah considered the question. "Scary," she said finally. "If my conviction gets overturned, it means I can stop hiding from my past and start building a real future. But I've gotten used to thinking of myself as someone whose life was essentially over. I'm not sure I know how to be someone with unlimited possibilities again." "That's where Dr. Santos comes in," Will said. "I talked to her yesterday, and she's very interested in meeting with you. Are you free this Thursday evening? She suggested dinner at a restaurant in Capitol Hill, somewhere casual where you can talk without feeling like you're in a formal interview." "Will she know about my case, about the court-martial?" "Only what I've told her, which is that you're a former combat medic whose military service ended under circumstances that are currently under review. She's worked with enough veterans to understand that military service can end in complicated ways that don't reflect on someone's character or competence." Sarah agreed to the dinner meeting, then spent the drive back to Seattle thinking about how radically her life might change over the next few months. The possibility of attending medical school, working as a doctor, and using her skills to help people again felt both exciting and terrifying. That evening, she sat in her studio apartment and began working on the personal statement required for the medical school pipeline application. For the first time in 3 years, she was writing about her future instead of just trying to survive her present. "My interest in medicine began when I was 12 years old, watching my younger brother struggle with a congenital heart defect," she wrote. "I learned that medicine isn't just about treating disease, it's about giving families hope when they feel most helpless." She paused, thinking about how to address her military service and the circumstances that had ended it. Hayes had advised her to be honest about her conviction while framing it in the context of the broader conspiracy that had exploited her. "My military service taught me that the best medical care often happens under the worst circumstances, and that the ability to remain calm and competent under pressure is as important as technical knowledge. My service also taught me that good people can make poor decisions when they're facing impossible choices, and that the medical profession has a responsibility to understand and address the social factors that affect health and healthcare access." It wasn't a complete draft, but it was a beginning. For the first time since her arrest in Afghanistan, Sarah Martinez was writing about her dreams instead of her regrets, her potential instead of her mistakes. And for the first time in 3 years, those dreams felt like they might actually be achievable. Dr. Rebecca Santos was not what Sarah had expected. Instead of the intimidating academic administrator she'd imagined, Santos was a warm woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She wore jeans and a casual sweater to their dinner meeting at a small Ethiopian restaurant in Capitol Hill, immediately putting Sarah at ease. "Will tells me you have an interesting background," Santos said as they settled into their booth. "Former combat medic, currently working retail and volunteering at Seattle General." "That's the simplified version," Sarah said carefully. "The full story is more complicated. The best stories usually are. Tell me about your medical experience." Sarah found herself describing her combat deployments with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years. Santos asked detailed questions about triage procedures, emergency surgical techniques, and working under pressure, the kinds of questions that reminded Sarah why she'd loved being a medic. "You handled blast trauma in field conditions?" Santos asked, clearly impressed. Most medical students don't see that level of trauma until their surgery rotations, if ever. We didn't have much choice, Sarah said. When casualties came in, you did whatever was necessary to keep them alive long enough to get them to a real hospital. That's exactly the kind of experience we value in our program, Santos said. Medical students who understand that medicine isn't just academic knowledge, it's the ability to make life or death decisions under pressure. Midway through dinner, Santos's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, then looked up at Sarah with surprise. That was Will. He says Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has news about your case, good news that couldn't wait until tomorrow. Sarah's heart rate spiked. Should I call her? Will's coming here, Santos said, checking her phone again. He says he has paperwork you need to see immediately. 20 minutes later, Will appeared at their table carrying a manila envelope and wearing the biggest smile Sarah had seen from him since their reunion. Hayes called me an hour ago, he said, sliding into the booth next to Santos. The Army Review Board's agency fast-tracked your case after reviewing the evidence. Your conviction has been officially overturned. Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Overturned? Already? Will handed her the envelope. Complete exoneration. Your conviction is vacated, your discharge has been upgraded to honorable, and you're eligible for immediate restoration of all veteran benefits. Sarah's hand shook as she opened the envelope and read the official documents. The language was formal and legal, but the meaning was clear. After 3 years, the Army had officially acknowledged that she had been wrongfully convicted. There's more, Will continued. The Army is also issuing a formal apology for the prosecutorial misconduct in your case, and you're eligible for compensation for the time you spent in military prison. Santos had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. Sarah, do you understand what this means for your medical school application? I can actually apply now, Sarah said, the reality starting to sink in. I have an honorable discharge and a clean record. Better than that, Santos said. You have documentation showing that you were wrongfully convicted due to military justice failures. That's not just a clean record, that's evidence of your character and resilience in the face of injustice. Will pulled out another document. Hayes also wanted you to know that the FBI investigation identified 12 other medics who were recruited using the same methods Rodriguez used on you. The military is reviewing all of their cases for similar prosecutorial misconduct. 12 other people went through what I went through? At least 12, Will said. And because your case was the first to be overturned, it's setting a precedent that will help all of them get justice. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of believing she was a criminal who had betrayed her oath and her fellow soldiers. Now she was learning that she'd actually been a victim of one of the largest military justice scandals in recent history. What happens now? She asked. Santos leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. Now you apply for our program. With your combat medical experience, your wrongful conviction story, and Will's recommendation, you'd be one of the strongest candidates we've ever considered. The application deadline isn't until January, Will added. That gives you 3 months to put together the strongest possible application. And in the meantime, Santos said, I'd like to offer you a position as a medical research assistant at the University of Washington. It would give you recent academic experience and help you prepare for the rigor of medical school. Everything was happening so fast that Sarah felt dizzy. A few hours ago, she'd been a convicted felon working retail and volunteering at a hospital. Now she was an exonerated veteran with job offers and medical school opportunities. I need to call my family, she said suddenly. Use my phone, Will offered. Call them right now. Sarah dialed Marcus's number with shaking fingers. When he answered, she could barely get the words out through her tears. Marcus, my conviction was overturned. I'm exonerated. They said I was wrongfully convicted. Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Sarah, Do you know what this means? It means I can go to medical school. It means I can become a doctor. It means you can stop punishing yourself for something that was done to you, Marcus said firmly. It means you can finally have the life you deserve. After Sarah hung up, the three of them sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally, looking at Will. "Why did you really spend so much time investigating my case? I know you said you felt responsible, but there had to be more to it than that." Will was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because watching talented medics get lost to the profession due to injustice is a tragedy that affects everyone. Every wrongful conviction removes someone from medicine who could have saved lives and trained the next generation of medical professionals." He paused, then continued more personally. "And because I've never forgotten watching you work in Afghanistan. You had instincts and skills that can't be taught, the kind of natural medical ability that comes along maybe once in a generation. The idea that those abilities were going to be wasted because of a flawed legal system bothered me more than I wanted to admit." Santos nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why our program exists, to identify people with exceptional potential who faced barriers to traditional medical education paths." 6 months later, Sarah Martinez walked across the stage at the University of Washington Medical School to receive her acceptance letter for the Military to Medical Pipeline program. In the audience, Marcus cheered loudly enough to embarrass their parents, while Will and Dr. Santos beamed with pride. Sarah's personal statement for the program had become a powerful narrative about resilience, justice, and the importance of understanding the social factors that affect healthcare access. Her story had been featured in several medical journals as an example of how military veterans could bring unique perspectives to civilian medicine. The morning after her acceptance ceremony, Sarah returned to Seattle General Hospital not as a volunteer, but as a first-year medical student beginning her clinical rotations under Will's supervision. "Ready for your first day as Dr. Martinez?" Will asked as they walked through the hospital corridors together. "I'm not Dr. Martinez yet," Sarah corrected, but she was smiling. "But for the first time in 4 years, I believe I actually will be someday." They paused outside the trauma bay where Sarah would begin her surgical training. Through the windows, they could see the organized chaos of a Level 1 trauma center. Nurses moving efficiently between patients, residents discussing treatment plans, attending physicians making rapid decisions that would save or lose lives. "Any regrets about leaving the bookstore?" Will asked. Sarah laughed. "David was incredibly supportive, but I think he always knew I was overqualified for retail. He said watching me reorganize their medical reference section was what convinced him I belonged in healthcare." "And how does it feel to be back in a medical environment?" Sarah looked around the trauma bay, watching the coordinated efforts of the medical team working to save a patient who had just been brought in by ambulance. She thought about her years as a combat medic, the lives she'd saved under impossible conditions, the skills she developed through training and instinct. "It feels like coming home," she said. As they entered the trauma bay to begin Sarah's first clinical rotation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The cross-shaped scar on her palm, the mark that had revealed her identity to Will and started the chain of events leading to her exoneration, was visible beneath her surgical gloves. 3 years earlier, that scar had felt like a reminder of her shame and failure. Now, it felt like the symbol of her resilience and her commitment to helping others, regardless of the obstacles she faced. Dr. Sarah Martinez was still 4 years away from earning her medical degree, but as she scrubbed in for her first surgery as a medical student, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. The supply theft conspiracy that had destroyed her military career had ultimately led her to a path that was better than anything she could have imagined. Sometimes justice took longer than it should, but when it finally arrived, it could restore not just a person's legal status, but their entire sense of who they were meant to be. And in Sarah's case, she was meant to be a doctor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.